The Weddell Sea lies in the southern reaches of the Atlantic Ocean, bounded by the Antarctic Peninsula on one side and the continent itself on the other. It is one of the most remote bodies of water on Earth. In winter, pack ice forms across its surface, creating vast floating fields that drift with currents and wind. The ice is not solid ground. It breaks, reforms, and moves in patterns that have never been fully predictable. Ships that venture into the Weddell Sea do so with the understanding that they may not leave as planned. The sea takes what it wants. In 1914, few understood this fact better than Ernest Shackleton. But understanding and surviving are different things. The water is black. The sky in winter is absent for months. There is no rescue. There is only ice and the men upon it. Ernest Henry Shackleton was born in County Kildare, Ireland, in 1874. By 1914, he was 40 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades pursuing polar exploration. He had been to Antarctica twice before. In 1901, he sailed with Robert Falcon Scott on the Discovery expedition. In 1907, he led his own expedition, the Nimrod expedition, which came within 97 miles of the South Pole before he made the decision to turn back. That decision saved his men. Shackleton had learned something that many explorers had not, that reaching a destination was less important than bringing everyone home alive. This philosophy would define him. By 1914, Shackleton had conceived of a new goal. He would attempt the first crossing of the Antarctic continent, not the pole itself, but the entire landmass. He would land on one side, traverse the interior, and emerge on the other. The journey was estimated at 1,700 miles. No one had ever done it. Shackleton began recruiting. He placed a newspaper advertisement that read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in event of success." The response was overwhelming. Thousands applied. Shackleton selected carefully. He chose men with specific skills: navigators, engineers, sailors, scientists, photographers. But he also chose for character. He wanted men who could endure not just physical hardship but psychological isolation. He needed people who would not break. Among those selected was Frank Worsley, an experienced sea captain; James Francie, a carpenter; Dr. Alexander Macklin, the ship's surgeon. The crew numbered 27 in total. In August 1914, they departed from London aboard a ship named the Endurance. The name was intentional. It referred to Shackleton's family motto, "By endurance we conquer." The Endurance was a purpose-built exploration vessel, wooden-hulled, reinforced for ice work. She was not particularly large. She was not particularly fast, but she was strong. For 2 months the Endurance sailed south, around Cape Horn and into the waters approaching Antarctica. By October, ice began to appear. At first it was scattered, isolated floes, manageable. The crew navigated around it. The ship moved forward. But as they progressed deeper into the Weddell Sea, the ice became denser. By November, it was everywhere. On November 24, 1914, the Endurance became trapped in pack ice. The ice had closed in on the ship from all sides, locking it in place. Shackleton made a decision. Rather than fight the ice or attempt to break free, he would allow the ship to drift with it. The ice moved with currents and wind. If they drifted long enough, they might be carried north, away from the Antarctic continent, back into open water. This strategy had a name: drifting with the ice. It had never been successfully completed, but Shackleton believed it was their only chance. The crew accepted the decision. They had entered the realm of waiting. No one knew how long they would wait. Life aboard the Endurance settled into a pattern of discipline and routine. The ship was locked in place, but the crew could not remain passive. There was work to be done. Shackleton established a strict schedule. The men would maintain the ship. They would conduct scientific observations. They would exercise to maintain fitness. They would preserve food and supplies. The Endurance had been provisioned for the land crossing, not for an indefinite period at sea. Shackleton rationed carefully. Every meal was calculated. Breakfast consisted of seal meat and biscuits, dried milk, and a hot drink. Lunch was a cold affair, biscuits, cheese, and margarine. Dinner was the main meal, hoosh, a stew made from seal meat, biscuits, and fat. It was monotonous, but it was enough. The ship drifted slowly northward through the winter months. Darkness fell. The sun disappeared below the horizon in May and did not return until July. For 2 months, there was only twilight and stars. The men adapted to it. They made games. They performed plays. They read books. Shackleton organized soccer matches on the ice nearby, using a seal carcass as a ball. The purpose was not recreation. The purpose was to maintain morale. Psychology was as important as food. A man who lost hope would not survive, regardless of provisions. A man who had purpose could endure almost anything. By midwinter, the ice they were drifting on was moving. It was not moving toward safety. The currents had shifted. The ice was being carried toward the coast of the Weddell Sea, not away from it. Shackleton realized that the drifting strategy, while sound in theory, was not delivering them to open water. The situation had changed. The ice was becoming more aggressive. Pressure was building. The floes were grinding against each other. The Endurance, locked in the middle, began to feel the strain. In September 1915, months into the drift, the ice around the Endurance began to move more violently. The ship had drifted approximately 346 miles by this point, but not in a direction that helped them. The ice was now converging. Two large floes were pressing against each other, and the Endurance was caught between them. The pressure was immense. The ship's wooden hull, despite its reinforcement, began to break. Water seeped into the lower levels. The pumps worked constantly. The crew worked in shifts, maintaining the pumps, sealing leaks, but the pressure continued. On October 27, 1915, the hull ruptured. Water flooded the ship. Shackleton made the decision to abandon her. The crew salvaged what they could: lifeboats, provisions, sleeping bags, navigational equipment. They transported these items onto the ice itself. The Endurance, after 11 months locked in the pack ice, slowly sank beneath the surface. By November 1915, she was gone. The crew now faced a different kind of survival. They were on the ice, not in a ship. Their shelter was no longer a vessel but a camp they called Ocean Camp. They had 3 lifeboats: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. They had approximately 2 tons of supplies salvaged from the ship. They were drifting on pack ice in the Weddell Sea with no certainty of rescue. Shackleton made another critical decision. They would not attempt to reach the Antarctic continent. They would not try to march across the ice. Instead, they would camp on the ice and continue to drift, waiting for their position to move them north into open water. Once in open water, they would attempt to reach Paulet Island, where supplies from a previous expedition were cached. If that failed, they would sail to South Georgia, a small island over 800 miles away. The days on Ocean Camp were repetitive and sparse. The men lived in tents, sleeping in sleeping bags. The ice beneath them was not stable. It was constantly moving and sometimes breaking apart. Shackleton organized the camp with military precision. There were watches. There were duties. There were regular meals. The food was severely rationed now. The provisions that had been adequate for a journey across land were being consumed in a period of indefinite waiting. Calculations were made. The food would last perhaps 4 months if carefully managed, 4 months to drift north, 4 months for the ice to carry them to safety. If it did not happen within that time, they would need to make difficult choices. During this period, the crew's primary danger was not starvation or cold, though both were constant. The danger was the ice itself. The floe they camped on was not permanent, it was breaking and reforming. Seals appeared frequently. The crew hunted them. The seal meat was vital. It provided food, yes, but it also provided blubber, which could be burned for heat. The psychological impact of successful hunts was equally important. It gave the men a sense of agency. They were not passive victims waiting for rescue. They were hunters, providing for themselves. Shackleton understood the importance of this distinction. As the months progressed, the ice carried them north. By December 1915, they were approaching open water. The plan was beginning to work, but it was working slowly. The men showed signs of wear. Their feet were damaged from the cold. Their teeth began to loosen, a sign of vitamin deficiency. Some men developed frostbite. Macklin, the surgeon, treated what he could. But medical supplies were limited. Disease became a concern. Infection was a constant threat. One man, a seaman named Thomas McLeod, developed what was diagnosed as blood poisoning. His condition deteriorated. He required constant care from Macklin. The crew maintained their duties despite the crisis. They understood that if McLeod died, morale would collapse. They willed him to survive. Against expectations, he recovered. The survival of one man lifted the spirits of all. By late December, the ice had carried them to approximately 69 degrees south latitude. Open water was close. In early January 1916, they reached it. The ice floe they had been camping on broke apart. They loaded their supplies and men into the 3 boats. The James Caird was the largest of the 3. It was also the most seaworthy. Shackleton made a decision. 5 men, himself, Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, Tom Crean, Timothy McCarthy, and John Vincent, would sail the James Caird to South Georgia to seek rescue. The remaining 22 men would sail the other 2 boats to Paulet Island, where supplies were cached. From there, they would wait for rescue or attempt another journey. It was a calculated risk. The James Caird journey was approximately 800 miles across some of the roughest ocean on Earth. The chance of success was not high. But it was the only option that offered any possibility of organized rescue. The James Caird departed on April 24, 1916. For the next 16 days, it sailed through seas of extraordinary violence. The boat was only 22 feet long. The waves in this region could exceed 30 feet. The crew was constantly wet. The temperature was barely above freezing. Fresh water was rationed. Food was minimal. Navigation was difficult. Worsley worked constantly to determine their position based on sun sightings and dead reckoning. The men took turns at the oars and tending to the sail. Shackleton did not rest. He remained awake, monitoring the situation, making decisions. On May 8, 1916, 16 days after departure, the small island of South Georgia appeared. They had navigated 800 miles of open ocean in a boat not much larger than a modern sailboat. The navigation was precise. Worsley's calculations had been exact. They had made landfall. But South Georgia was not a rescue point. No one lived on the island except whalers at a station on the far side. The 5 men of the James Caird were still 32 miles from the whaling station. The boat could not reach it directly. The coast was dangerous. Shackleton made another decision. 3 men, himself, Worsley, and Tom Crean, would attempt to walk across the island's interior to the station. The other 2 men would remain with the boat. The interior of South Georgia is mountainous and glaciated. No one had ever crossed it, but Shackleton did not have time to consider the impossibility. They had been awake for over 30 hours. They had minimal equipment. They carried a rope, a cook pot, and some food. They had a compass. They walked for 36 hours without stopping. They crossed mountains. They descended into valleys. They crossed glaciers. At one point, they became lost in darkness. They descended by feel, unsure whether they would fall to their deaths. When dawn came, they realized they had descended the correct slope. At the end, they reached the whaling station at Stromness. The whalers, seeing three wild men emerge from the mountains, barely recognized them as human. The station manager, a man named Sorrel, provided shelter and food. He arranged for a rescue ship to be sent to Paulet Island, but there was a complication. The ice conditions in the Weddell Sea had worsened. The ship sent to rescue the men stranded at Paulet Island could not reach them. Multiple attempts were made. The ice turned back every vessel. Shackleton waited. He was safe. The 22 men under Frank Wild's command at Paulet Island were still in danger. Shackleton could not rest. He arranged for another ship, larger and more powerful, to make another attempt. In August 1916, 4 months after the James Caird had reached South Georgia, a Chilean ship named the Yelcho was able to break through the ice and reach Paulet Island. All 22 men were alive. All were rescued. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition had failed in its primary objective. The continent was not crossed, but there were no deaths directly attributable to the journey. Every man who had boarded the Endurance in England returned alive. The survival was complete. Shackleton returned to England in May 1917. The First World War was ongoing. The public was distracted. The expedition received less attention than it might have in peacetime, but among those who studied it, the significance was clear. Shackleton's leadership had held the group together under circumstances that broke other men. His decision-making had been sound. His priorities had been correct. He had chosen men. He had chosen survival. He had succeeded. The Endurance expedition became, in retrospect, a case study in human endurance. Historians and psychologists examined it. Business schools taught it. Military organizations studied it. What was it about Shackleton and his crew that allowed them to survive? The answers were several. There was the careful selection of crew. There was the maintenance of routine and purpose. There was the emphasis on morale. There was the flexibility of leadership, the willingness to change plans when circumstances demanded it. There was also something less definable. There was a culture among the crew that defied resignation. When the situation was hopeless, they did not surrender to hopelessness. They worked. They maintained discipline. They believed without certainty that rescue would come. The Endurance sank. The crossing of Antarctica did not happen, but the men lived. In the Weddell Sea, in the darkness and the ice, where the probability of survival was minimal, 27 men came home.